We're going to kick off our panel for this morning, and as the panel comes on board, let me just introduce them. The final panel is going to be led by Mr. Jeffrey White, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. He will set the groundwork for the panel on contracting, acquisition, logistics, and technology for integrated reform. The panel moderator is Major General Jim Rogers, United States Army retired, Vice President, Army Programs Integration, Lockheed Martin Government Affairs. The panel members are Alexis L. Ross, Ph.D., Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army, Strategic and Acquisition Reform. Stuart Hazlett, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army, Procurement, Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. Jim McAleese, Principal and Owner, McAleese and Associates, LLC. And Mr. Andy Hove, President and Chief Executive Officer, AM General, LLC. Turn it over to you, Mr. White. Thank you all.
All right. Well, welcome. This is an exciting panel. They leave the best for last. We're here. Thanks for coming. Actually, a very good turnout. We've got kind of the who's who. You talk about acquisition and contracting reform. You have the leads in the Army here that are working toward all of that. So this is going to be an exciting panel. I challenge you for challenging questions because I don't have to answer any of them. Mr. White does. All right, so let's get started. So Pat McCuistion, thank you very much. She actually introduced the panel already. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And we'll ask Mr. White to start it off with a few comments, and then we're going to go down the line and ask for comments. And at the end of that, we'll open it up for questions. Sir?
Thank you. That's good. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's nice to look out at the audience and see there are at least a few others of you that couldn't get a flight out last night. Hopefully won't disappoint you for this morning. So on behalf of our Army Acquisition, our 10 PEOs, 2 joint PEOs, 7 DASAs, 2 executive directors, and about 41,000 acquisition professionals, I'm pleased to be here today. The reason I read those numbers off is because it's a big enterprise and it's a big ship. And, you know, big ships are tough to turn. But what I want to focus on today is how we're trying to turn that ship and engage acquisition reform. Anytime you're trying to do a reform, you need to work on the culture of the organization, and we're no different. We have to fundamentally change some of our cultural biases and the ways we were used to doing business. So within ASALT, we've decided that our leadership philosophy needs to have 4 focus areas. First of all, you know, we need to leverage the acquisition reforms that Congress has given us. We've got some 804 authorities, we've got OTA authorities. We've actually got a fair amount of flexibility within what Congress has given us. We need to take those, we need to leverage them, and we need to, you know, maximize the effect that we can get out of them. You've heard throughout this conference that we need to accelerate fielding. We need to drive into our acquisition professionals the culture that 12 years is too long to get a major weapon system out in the field. We need to look and innovate at the speed of industry today, not the speed of industry in the 70s. So that to that end, we've got to accelerate our overall fielding processes. Secretary Esper is fond of saying, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the better. We need to be able to get a solution that's better than what we have now, that's the 80%, as you often hear, drive forward and get it out to our soldiers. We also have to accelerate our technology. In other words, we have to understand what the technology is out there and integrate current technology into our weapons system, not the technology that we're most comfortable with, that we're wedded to, that's 5 and 10 years old. We need to get current technology that's been developed commercially and will benefit the Army. And finally, we need to have accountability. You've heard all the stories about acquisition failures in the past. There wasn't a lot of accountability for why they didn't succeed. We need to hold our acquisition professionals accountable for their programs, not just when they're great successes, but also when they're failures. And by that, I don't mean a hunt for the guilty and punish the innocent. I mean, we need to hold ourselves accountable, learn from it, and do better the next time. So in changing the culture, we really need to focus on a few things. One is reducing the requirements process. You heard Mike Murray talk about that earlier in the week. They've got a great process in there where they're trying to drive it down from a 5-year process down to a process of less than a year, sometimes 12 weeks, is the objective. We need to prototype early, test early, learn from it, test again, refine, and recycle. We need to do those iterations and spirals and understand what it is we're looking for, what the technology will support, and use it to deliver a better system. Again, I'm going to hit, we need to quickly deliver those capabilities to our soldiers, not just in the total fielding, but we need to get them into their hands during the prototyping and tech maturation process and make sure that what we're delivering is something that they can use, integrate, and learn easily. And finally, and what I think is most important, is we need to improve our collaboration with industry. Those of you that have heard me talk before know that one of the things I hammer our PEOs and our PMs on all the time is somehow within the Army we got the culture over the past decade or so that we shouldn't talk with industry. We might provide an unfair advantage to somebody. We might inadvertently give away some piece of contracting information that we shouldn't have, and we'll put our programs at risk. And we've developed a risk-averse culture that doesn't allow us to, or that has led us to believe we should not engage with industry, and nothing could be further from the truth. We've got to engage with industry. We've got to do it as often as possible and as frequently as possible. Dr. Jetty and I are fond of saying, along with all the DASs, if you don't talk to industry, how do you expect them to know what you want? And I think you're going to hear that refrain again and again, this year, next year, until it becomes ingrained. We want you all to be able to go in and see any PEO and any PM whenever you want, and we want you to be able to have an open and honest dialogue. We're not going to give you competition-sensitive information. We're not going to tell you what your competitors are doing, but we ought to be able to have a dialogue with you and make sure that you know what we want and understand what our requirements are. We have a couple of signature initiatives that are underway to help with our cultural change. Dr. Ross is here to expand more on them. But you've heard a lot about OTA or other transactional authorities. We like those. We're using them a lot. I think we've got about 100 OTAs out there right now that are just pure OTAs, not ones that are also connected to Section 804. But OTAs allow us to move very rapidly. It can cut it 6 months to a year off the acquisition process. If we have a pretty good idea of what we're looking for, it's a great way to get prototyping and tech maturation into the cycle so that we can have a full and open competition later down the road. Middle tier acquisition or Section 804, you heard the Undersecretary talk about that on his opening remarks. We have more of those going on than any other service, 8 of them right now, and I think we've got about another 4 or 5 teed up that we're going to move forward on the future. Middle tier acquisition is something that fits greatly when fits great when you're also working it with OTA. It allows us to shorten the acquisition cycle by aligning the resources, the requirements, and the actual acquisition. We can tailor the acquisition of the program we want, so we're not doing unnecessary things. We see this as a great path forward, but also one that shouldn't be abused. Congress gave us this authority. We need to make sure we use it on appropriate programs. We're probably never going to buy, a new aircraft under a strict mid-tier acquisition, but there's lots of smaller programs that would benefit from that. And in some cases, maybe we will buy an aircraft on an MTA, but we've got to use it correctly and make sure that we meet Congress's intent when we move forward on it. We're bound and determined to improve our understanding and our use of intellectual property across the Army. When I got here from industry, I heard people opine we need to own all the intellectual property for every weapon system that we buy. We should, quote, be able to 3D print every tank and aircraft. That's never going to happen. We can't afford it, even if it was technologically capable. But we need to better articulate what our technical and software data requirements and rights are, what our intentions are. We need to communicate that to industry so that we're all on the same page. We need to negotiate it, we need to pay you fairly for it, and we need to protect it. And be happy to talk about that later on in the presentation. Then finally, advanced manufacturing. Advanced manufacturing is one of those emerging technologies that has capability to really revolutionize how we do business and acquisition. Whether it's focusing on the digital twin and what that allows you to do in terms of experimentation and prototyping, or where it feeds into the intellectual property and the ability to 3D print components and pieces. It has the promise of being able to reduce our logistical tail and instantly give us parts availability for key parts out on the battlefield and reduce our downtime of major weapon systems. So we need to embrace this technology and move forward with it as quickly as possible. That's what I'm focusing on in my part of the ALT enterprise. Be happy to talk to you all and take questions about that during the panel. And with that, I'm going to pass you off to Dr. Ross, who actually has to do the hard work of putting all this into policy and action, and who has to really understand the details of the laws and the policies. And Alexis, you want to go ahead and tell them how you're doing that?
Sure. Morning. So I'm going to highlight a couple of initiatives that we have ongoing. As you heard from the Under earlier this week and several Army senior leaders at this event, the Army is focused extensively on modernization. It's obvious in our budget transmission that went to the Hill. You'll hear it again and again in testimony to Congress over the next hearing cycle. And the Secretary has made it clear in his priorities that we're pursuing reform in order to enable modernization. So there are a variety of ongoing reform efforts in ASALT right now. I'm going to touch on two that enable modernization: Intellectual Property Initiative and the Advanced Manufacturing Initiative that's underway right now. So for intellectual property, the Secretary signed an Army-wide policy memo on intellectual property management in December, and then the Assistant Secretary of the Army, Dr. Jetty, released an implementation guidance soon thereafter. So this is intended to improve our modernization as well as readiness. I'm going to focus my talk today on modernization. So the intent here is to, from a modernization perspective, is to incentivize industry to do more work with us, to tap into their innovative and entrepreneurial spirit, and to partner together as much as possible. So in the past, we've often defaulted to two approaches, either obtaining too much or too little IP, and neither really was a good scenario for us. Obtaining too much drove away industry partners, it's cost prohibitive, and frankly, it's impractical. Obtaining too little really leaves us in a poor situation later on in the sustainment phase, leaves us very few options. So what we're trying to do is recognize that it's not black and white, and the new policy is attempting to provide a framework for the workforce to navigate this complex IP landscape and to take a more nuanced, savvy customer approach. There are 4 tenets that underpin the policy. The first is open communication with industry. Mr. White talked a lot about that. This is a critical thing for ASALT. We need to do a better job communicating our rights intentions earlier with industry up front so that both parties can enter into an agreement in a mutually beneficial way. The second is developing customized IP strategies. So we have to do a better job at understanding our full life cycle needs while we're designing our acquisition program. And that puts a lot of pressure on the program managers and those offices, but it's a worthy endeavor. We will be needing to look at our short and our long-term needs, and we too often focus on the short term. The third tenet is negotiating custom licenses with industry. So once we have developed a strategy that's tailored to that particular acquisition and to the specific characteristics of that weapon system, then we need to approach industry and negotiate for the data we actually need, so the appropriate data, not all of the data. The fourth and final tenet is negotiating early enough in the process to enable competitive prices. This is your basic commonsensical economic principle. We need to use competition so that we are in a better position to ensure that we have appropriate prices for the taxpayer dollar. So another reform initiative that is driving modernization is advanced manufacturing. Mr. White mentioned earlier our interest in this. This is the next initiative coming down the pipe. We're working with AMC and AFC on this one. AM is, just for a quick preview in case you're unaware, AM is the combination of advanced techniques like AI and robotics and 3D printing combined with traditional manufacturing techniques. And advanced manufacturing, or AM, is something that's going to really help us to maintain overmatch. This is the way that the industry is going across the globe. Our adversaries are already investing in this. We need to do the same in order to take full advantage of its promise. What's so exciting about it is going to free us from the limitations of traditional manufacturing. So we'll now be able to design for function rather than any of the manufacturing capabilities. So faster time to market, greater customization, and better capabilities. Specifically, in the near term, I think we'll be very interested in seeing what it can do to quickly and affordably produce prototypes. I think that's going to be very interesting for AFC. So we're in the midst of developing a policy on that. It's expected probably later in the summer, maybe the early summer. And in short, in closing, these are two the Secretary of the Army's initiatives that are great steps forward for modernization, and I would be happy to answer any questions about them.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Mr. Hazlett?
Yeah, thank you. As the senior contracting official in the Army, I get to look at things from a different perspective often because I'm accountable to help with everything from soup, bolts, nuts, all the way to major systems, right? So I focus in on the use of even the government purchase card, having new legislation that allowed us to move to $10,000 at a limit. And I only bring that up is because assisting and contributing to modernization, oftentimes, how are we acquiring our things and how can we get things that help us very quickly? I try to bucket the things that my priorities are in three big buckets. One is data. And data, procurement execution, and with talent management. In the data, where I want to talk about that first is because that comes with knowledge of metrics. We have to know what we are buying, how we are buying it, if we're ever going to improve it. We have gone over the years, we haven't had the sophistication to actually have the transparency into our own cycle times of buying same or similar types of commodities to know how can we target what steps are in there that take us through an award. Now we're able to do that. We've set up some of our categories across the same categories that the OMB has put out for the entire federal government. So we in the Army have followed that, and we have 19 categories, 10 of those which are commercial, 9 of those defense unique. I can look at those categories now, and I can say, when does something start, and when does it go to award? And I can look at steps in there, such as the solicitation preparation, the release of the RFP, how long does it take to go from a proposal receipt to award and to selection and then to award? And by looking at that, we can now target and say where are opportunities. Maybe there's a law that's causing us not to be able to move more deliberately. Maybe there's a policy, a process, but allows us to laser in on that. It can even take us down to an organizational level to say maybe I just have an attrition problem. I got a training problem. I've got an opportunity that we've just brought in some new recruits, and it's going to take a little while. So how do we work that to maybe transition some of our priority workload to other areas? And in the data aspect of metrics, we've suffered many times from not having strategic measurements for the procurement field. And we have many tactical measurements, but not very many procurement. So we have gone into 4 strategic measurements that we are looking at the health of the contracting enterprise. That is the procurement administrative lead time from receipt of a complete requirements package till that award. As I've just talked about, we're looking at small business and competition. And I'm looking at small business and competition the same way by categories of same or similar types of commodities that we know. How can I go in and target where I need to improve competition instead of making it across the board type of policy changes? Right. And the last being talent management. I don't know if many of you got an opportunity to hear me talk about the opportunity to do competency, capability, and the capacity of our workforce, because when it comes right down to it, people, it's our resources, our most valuable asset, and I leave you with that competency will breed and allow confidence, and if we have a confident workforce, we have a workforce that will stop being risk adverse and possibly move into a more prudent type of business making. Under procurement execution, under that bucket, I have a lot of different initiatives, as we talked about. How does contracting agreements officers, a whole new stratification of individuals that may have to know the regs, the laws, and the policies so well so they can work from a clean sheet of paper and know where they can go outside the lines to help that cycle time, to help us with the field of capability a lot faster. So I look at those agreements officers as being the best in class. And we have to make sure that we are growing those individuals to get to that position. Contract type. For decades, we've gone from, well, which type of contract should we use? Should it be anywhere from a cost reimbursement to a fixed price on that continuum of risk? And that is, right now, what we're looking for is to go more on the fixed price incentive firm target on development, and in other areas, even in the acquisition of services, which is a great deal of what our spend is. I'm also looking at source selections. How are we doing those competitive source selections? What process are we using? I brief monthly to the secretary and to the chief, contract type, where are we doing over $100 million on major systems, which ones are cost, which ones are fixed price, and why. I brief them also on the source selection choice, which ones are LPTA, which ones are best value trade-off, which ones are value-adjusted total evaluated price. And are we making the right decisions? Because we all know the ultimate importance of going through an evaluation smartly so that we're not held up for making any kind of mistakes along that way. The last I would say is on delegation of authorities. We're delegating as much as we can down to the lowest level possible, and we're having trust into our professionals that they can make those decisions. By doing those delegations as far down as we can, what we've learned from our cycle times, a lot of those added time on an acquisition is imposed by ourselves. We got to look in the mirror and say, I'm doing this. I'm doing extra reviews, or I'm asking somebody's opinion that may not even be a subject matter expert, and that's adding time. So we're trying to get to the point where we can delegate down and say, we trust you, we have your back, do what's right. So with that, I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Okay. Did you want to go next?
Thank you. And I'll be followed by Jim McAleese of McAleese and Associates. If you don't know him, he is a thought leader for the country in budget and congressional actions. So, Jim?
Sir, good morning. Oh, yeah, it's a hot crowd. I came to the right place. Okay. Let me just leave you with about 4 thoughts. First thing, how many, it's hard to see you guys from up here, so how many of you guys have read your budget yet? Okay, I'm in a good, when your budget first came out, the Army announced $191 billion for 2020. I was ecstatic. I fundamentally concluded that the Army had received the same 5% budget increase that the Air Force had received, and as well as the Navy had received. Once I started decomposing your budget, what I found was a much different situation. What I really found was that your budget was basically flatlined in 2020. right? So that extra $9.2 billion of what I thought was the big growth that the Army was getting in 2020 actually turned out to be the emergency wall construction. So for those of you who have not yet looked in there, it's not going to help the Army. It's about $2 billion of hurricane for the Air Force for Tyndall, and also for the Marine Corps Camp Lejeune. It's about $3.6 billion of 2020 MILCON that the department will use to reimburse the 2019 MILCON that could be used for the border wall. And it's about another $3.6 billion of new 2020 MILCON money for the border wall. So the good news, I have none to deliver you, sir, on the top line. I apologize. But what I can tell you is that what the leadership was talking about the night court turned out to be absolutely true, right? When I take apart your budget this year, I can see big jumps, about a 9% jump in RDT&E. So you're growing from about $11.4 billion to about $12.4 billion. It's only $1 billion of actual growth, but what I can see when I look inside that portfolio is major shifts, and I'll kind of walk you through some of the big things I see. You also grew your O&M by about 4%, right? For readiness, that's about a $3 billion bill, so it now goes up to about $61 billion. And you also grew the mill per account by about 1%, about $1 billion, which puts you at about $63 billion. So what I've told you so far is you had a flat budget for 2020, you added another $1 billion for RDT&E, you added $3 billion for O&M, and you added another $1 billion for mill per. And so the bad news today is to tell you that by default, the natural bill payer was procurement in 2020. So procurement fell by about 6%. It's going to be about $26 billion altogether. And what I wanted to warn you about is, okay, yep, I got it. The aircraft procurement fell by about 12%. This is the 5 AH-64 new builds that we were expecting to see. Aircraft mods were cut. You saw missile procurement being cut a little bit, about 5%, right? So instead of buying $5 billion in missile procurement this year, you're going to buy about $4.6 billion, right? And so you see big surges in there. Gimlers, 10,000 Gimlers, fantastic news. 5,000 Hellfire, doubling of production, fantastic news. The bill payers were things like the PAC-3 MSE missile or the Javelin missile. When you get to things that were down on the exhibit floor, like ground combat vehicle production, you see much of the same thing. So we're seeing about a 6% drop in the ground combat vehicles, right? Obvious bill payers were Bradley, right? AMPV, and also a flatlining of the Paladin production PIM. The good news, by the way, for those of you who do ammo, right? I don't hear anybody clapping, sir. Right, we need more ammo. There's General Abramson is here somewhere. I can sense him. We do see about a 10% increase in ammo procurement, right, this year. That's going to be all small arms, and it's going to be mortars. And last but not least, there's a cut that's happening inside the other procurement army, and I have to hold Andy Hove when I do this because his Humvees are in there. And those are basically JLTVs are going to be cut, tactical network technology, things that are in the comms and electronics, and obviously also combat support, things like generators, right? So what's the good news that I want to give you today? The good news is that I can fundamentally tell you, and I literally finished your review of the Army budget at 2 o'clock, I guess yesterday morning, before I got on the plane to fly down here, right? So the Army leadership talk about the discussion of the night court, it's absolutely true, and I can see it in your budget. The opportunities that I see for you guys when I ground through the thousands of pages inside your budget is fundamentally that the Army leadership has made a decision to cut approximately $30 billion in 2020 through 2024. But I can actually see, program by program by program, I can see the $57 billion worth of growth, right, in that same period of time, particularly procurement in 2023 and 2024. So basically, the way I would characterize the night court decisions is a $1 cut, right, will basically get you a $2 return in terms of procurement, particularly in 2023, 2024. When I've gone through your budget in the past, procurement's super easy, aircraft, missiles, ammo, WTCV, OPA, right? Typically, the RDT&E budget, it's not broken out by functionality, it's just broken out by time. Basic research, applied research, advanced technology development, advanced component development, SDD, RDT&E management support for the whole deal. and then operational systems development to add additional lethality to something that's already fielded. Last year at this time, if you had asked me, I would have told you it would take me an entire day to find you all of the future vertical lift money, right? Because there's all sorts of little enabling things in applied research, there's money over in advanced technology development. I can tell you unequivocally that has fundamentally changed. Your budget has been completely restructured, particularly the RDT&E, and I think this is fantastic news. That's why I'm such a big believer in it. It has been completely restructured to the 8 new capability gaps. The moment you open up that applied research, you're going to get hit right in the face with long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicles, future vertical lift, network, air missile defense, soldier lethality, assured PNT, and also synthetic training environment, right? And what you're going to be able to do when you go through for the first time, you can actually see if I invest in this program now, right, in applied research, what the return is going to be. You can actually go through now for the first time and see in applied research what money is going to future vertical lift. You can go into advanced technology development and fundamentally see what else is going into future vertical lift. By the time you get to advanced component development, which is really where future, FVL really lives, all of a sudden you see this explosive $450 million of real FVL money, about a 400% increase. And it's, I don't want to get carried away, sir, I'm getting emotional. It's actually beautiful because for a budget guy, you can actually see the first $427 million is going to FARA, and she's going to be fast-paced, and you can see FLRA coming in right behind her at $32 million, right? So the good news that I can tell you is the deal that was reached in night court, the $30 billion of cuts, in exchange for $57 billion of future growth, is actually quite true, and it is reflected in your program of record. Secondly, what I can tell you is that when I look at basically your budget, for this deal to work, you're basically cutting $30 billion of programs, right? But it fundamentally, the $57 billion has to materialize into procurement, or at least long lead procurement, or advanced procurement, or basic LRIP money, hopefully by 2023 and 2024. Otherwise, from my external perspective, you're basically cutting $30 billion worth of programs in the hope that in the next POM cycle, you're going to be able to recapture that money, right? So what I'm warning you today, and I've seen it in all of the leadership, I saw it in General Milley and Esper at their SASC hearing on Tuesday. I saw it in Esper and Milley yesterday, last night at SAC-D. I saw it in Undersecretary McCarthy when he briefed his keynote, right? And I even saw it in General Murray when that question came up from the audience about the optionally manned fighting vehicle. It will now become one of the critical parameters of all of your programs will now become speed, right? Because if you can't package as much lethality or as much cost imposition as you can into that platform and be able to put it into a position where you have the highest probability of getting into low-rate initial production in 2023 or 2024, then I'm afraid this grand deal that the Army has reached will begin to deteriorate, right? I'm anticipating, I can see this already in optionally manned fighting vehicle, right? I can see it, the speed with which FARA has picked up. You can see it in lower tier air missile defense, the Patriot replacement, right? With you going to the sense-off, which is what, about a month from now, sir? Right, and so the speed of the acquisition programs has fundamentally tripled, right? That's going to mean a couple things, and let me close on this note. It's probably going to mean two things to the contractors. Number one, you're going to have to absolutely perform, right? No ifs, ands, or buts. The trade space is going to become performance. Schedule is going to become very, very inflexible, because if that procurement slips out of 2023, 2024, there's no guarantee that the money is going to come back. So if you have a program execution problem, particularly in development, or if you have a quality assurance escape in the LRIP production, right, my fundamental assumption is the Army leadership at the next night court is probably going to flatline your program and is going to move that growth that you were expecting. They're going to move that to another program that can get into procurement by 2024. Right? Let's see, the last thing I would tell you is, let's see, I'm running out of time. Contractors are going to have to spend more on IRAD, right? Obviously, the contractors have rolled out their 2019 guidance. So it's going to be difficult to do, but fundamentally, if I'm compressing the schedules for the acquisition programs, it means that the contractor's going to have to pick up more of the tab in terms of IRAD. So yesterday there was a lot of discussion over the last 2 days about lower tier air missile defense, right? So it's going into a sense-off, right, in basically a month to 2 months' time. So as you know, I follow all the major contractors. I play no favorites, right? So I'm sitting there in 4Q enjoying the contractor results. I had already finished Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop. I'm sitting in Raytheon, wonderful, awake, blissful. And all of a sudden in 4Q of 2018, there's suddenly an $80 million spike in IRAD. And specifically where the spike occurred was in the integrated defense system sector, which is the home of Patriot. And so what I'm really trying to warn you is, whether it's optionally manned fighting vehicle, whether it's FARA, whether it's LTA-MDS, even the extended range cannon artillery, the more aggressive contractors are already beginning to increase their IRAD investments to make sure that they can hold that schedule. And the last thought I leave you with is, all things come and go in time. I see what we're doing right now with 2018, 2019, and 2020 as a once-in-a-generation Reagan-era defense buildup, right? So when we saw the budget request grow by $50 billion in 2018, and then the 2018-2019 BBA came along and Congress added another $25 billion on top of that, for the last 2 years, we've been living on $75 billion of extra money, right? And then we added $19 billion more in 2019, and now we're asking for another 3% of that on top of that in 2020. I can hear it in the Army leadership, whether it's Esper, Milley, McCarthy, McConville, even down to General Murray and Dr. Jetty and Mr. White. You've got to take advantage of this opportunity. I can't tell whether it'll be a change in administration. I can't tell whether it'll be a worldwide financial crisis. But generally, historically, Reagan-era defense buildups, they come about every 10 to 20 years, and they last about 2 to 4 years. So if you're not in that fight, you know, with General Murray and with Gus Perna and with Dr. Jetty and Mr. White, you need to get in that fight now. So let me shut up, sir. I'm sorry.
No, very good. Very insightful. Mr. Andy Hove is the president and CEO of AM General. Andy?
Yeah, thanks. So I get to represent the receiving end of this entire conversation, right? Not just as AM General. I've worked for almost every company out on the floor today. It's my objective in life to work for every one of them. So I'm gonna give you my comments from the perspective of industry, and not just my perspective as a president and CEO of AM General today, but where I've been before. I've sold to the Army everything from tents to CBRN filters to Bradley fighting vehicles that run over 300 million lines of software code. So I'll try and simplify this, right? The Army is declaring what they want when they want it. They presented to Congress the resources that they think they need to get what they want. And at some point there has to be a dialogue with everybody who provides them those products and services that they want. And between that, you have, you know, it starts with understanding what it is the Army needs. There has to be a natural and deep dialogue to get to that point. Then it has to get formalized where it can actually get put on contract in some process, and then it needs to get delivered. And as Jim pointed out, there is and has always been a forward posture on the part of industry to make the investments even before it gets on contract. And that is, by the way, a completely at-risk investment. So let me kind of characterize industry's perspective, right? Almost every company out on the floor today and engaged in this dialogue is a global company. Everyone competes on a global scale. For a lot of us, the Army is an incredibly important customer. It's not our only customer. And so the investment choices that we make, the products we deliver, the services we develop, really have to be at a global scale where the Army is an important piece of our business, but not the only part of our business. And so, you know, we benchmark how deep that dialogue is, how clearly we understand what the U.S. Army wants compared to everybody else who wants products and services. We benchmark the Army's processes to buy those things compared to everyone else. And it's, it has gotten better, but I would, and Jeff knows this, I've made this comment before, that over the last 10, 15 years, the Army's actually taken a step back in its ability to have just a normal discussion with industry of this is what I want. My description to you of what I want is not a contract obligation to buy what I want. It's just a description of what I want. That conversation needs to happen a lot more transparently, a lot more often, and shouldn't be encumbered by a bunch of other stuff hanging around. It's just a natural conversation that needs to happen. Then, at some point, it transitions to, okay, this is the resources that I have, I'm prepared to enter into a formal contract. That's a different conversation that also needs to happen much more streamlined and across the board, on not just, finding OTAs as a salvation to get things on contract quickly. Everything needs to get on contract quickly, from Army Cook's Whites to the optionally manned fighting vehicle. And there are opportunities to streamline that within the statutory authority that the Army has today. There is a lot of stuff added on top of their processes that I think the Army would do well looking at streamlining effectively. And then if you read the testimony last night, Senator Durbin asked the Secretary, what other changes to the law the Army needed to do this quickly. And I would just recommend to the Army that they be expansive in what they ask for to get these things done. And it has to be, the Army's, in this budget, the Army's going to buy a lot of stuff, not just the optionally manned fighting vehicle. It's going to buy everything that's in the budget, and holistically, top to bottom, there's opportunity to improve that process.
Thank you very much. All right. Hey, we got some great questions. All right. So you've got 3 assistant secretaries up here, industry, and notably one of the most influential discussion commentators on the DOD.
That's Andy Hove.
Yeah. So the first one's going to Mr. White. All of the discussion on changing the risk-averse acquisition culture is great, and we in industry have heard it for years. How will the Army drive procedures and policies to the acquisition professionals to create change and results?
Okay. Well, I was told once you always start with saying that's a great question, whether it is or not. That is a great question because, we all wonder about that. Sure, I heard that back when I was a lieutenant, and I still don't see it today. So like anything that you want to drive when you're talking about change, is you have to lead by example, I think, to get to the heart of that question. We tell our PMs and PEOs to engage with industry. We tell them it's important. Part of it is by establishing that is one of their priorities. Everything can't be a priority. If everything is, then nothing is, right? We've all heard that. So you've got to set X number of priorities for them and say this absolutely engaging with industry is number one. And I think we've done that. And then you got to follow through on yourself. So, in ASALT, many of you I've seen in my office, I do 3 industry engagements almost every day. They come in, and see me. I see big companies, I see little companies. I see new tech, I see old tech. I've seen things where I look at it and say, my God, that is the most fascinating thing I have ever seen in my life. I had no idea it even existed. I don't know where we could possibly use it in the Army, but boy, that is cool. But more often I see things where I look and say, boy, that is just great stuff. Have you talked to PEO, whomever? And usually the answer I get is we didn't know who to go see in the Army, and that's why we asked to come in and see you. And what our staff does in the front office is, we talk with the industry, figure out hopefully where the best fit is, and we refer them on appropriately to that PEO, because I also probably told many of you I'm not a PEO. I don't really have any money. I just get a vote sometimes. once they get in to see the PEO, then we can start to leverage their ideas and their technology. I always start every meeting pretty much the same way. You sit down, got a little table in my office, and I look across and say, what brings you here today and how can I help you? And what I really, really don't want to hear is, gosh, Mr. White, we didn't want to see you. We really wanted to see PEO whatever, but we couldn't get in to see him. I think most of the PEOs will tell you that's a bad day. That's when it starts. I think we can all make time to see industry. I think I've got an extra hour and a half, 2 hours in my day to see three industry groups, and I think all the PEOs understand that they have that obligation as well. Our PEOs are very, very talented people, and they're great leaders, and they're driving that culture down to our PMs. And if you haven't seen those results, I hope that you will. I take this very personally. I left the Army in 2010 and went to industry. I had been a career SES at that point, and when I got into industry, I found out how hard it was to come back and see myself. The company I represented, I thought, had a great product that would really help the Army. I gave up on it. It was too hard to get in to see the PM. I just couldn't figure out how to do it. It was so doggone hard, it was easier to walk away. The profit margin wasn't that high, and I figured I'd focus on something else. I don't want to see that happen under our administration or our watch. Dr. Jetty doesn't want to see it happen. So we're bound and determined that if you want to get in to see a PM, that you get that opportunity. And there's lots of little things we can do to do that as well. One of the things I always insist on when I go around is show me your web page, and show me on the web page where it says, you want to contact us, this is how to do it. And then if you ask my XO, they'll tell you, frequently I say, okay, write to that Dropbox and see if anybody answers you back. Or if there's a telephone number on there, call it and see if anybody answers it. Because how many times have we seen, if you want to talk to the PM, call Jeff White at such and such extension, and they say, who? He left 5 years ago. We've got to change the culture so that we're accessible, everybody knows how to get a hold of us, and we're doing the best we can to do that. It's going to take some time to change. As I said earlier, we're a big organization, but I think it's about making it the priority and then setting the example from the top all the way to the bottom. And incidentally, Dr. Jetty, his schedule is brutal. I see Heidi Shue up there. You can ask her what her schedule looked like. But he makes time to see industry whenever he can as well, and he enjoys the heck out of it. That's the kind of example you have to set, and that's what ends up changing your culture.
Yeah, and leading by example is a big key. I'm not sure when he sleeps, to be honest, but he does see folks and then passes them. Actually, we had an opportunity to talk to Dr. Ross about advanced manufacturing by meeting with Mr. White and saying, this is pretty good, you need to go talk to Dr. Ross. So it does work, so I appreciate that. Here's one on OTA to POR. And so this is for Mr. Hazlett, and then Mr. Hove, I'd like you to comment on it after that, if you would. In the use of OTA to rapidly develop a prototype has distinct advantages to the Army. It also gives a distinct advantage to the company doing the prototype. How do you ensure that when you get to the competitive phase that there's actually an ability to compete on an even playing field?
Yeah, thank you. I'd say it was a nice question, but it's a hard question. I think the use of OTAs, if you take them and you combine that with a Section 804, a rapid fielding, you got something, right? You do it. I'm excited about OTAs. Just to baseline ourselves, we are using these more than any other service. We have grown immensely. I'm thinking 2018, we did about $3 billion worth. We've already done in FY19 $1.7 billion. So we are on path, and we're going to keep using those. And as we use them, we keep learning more. And a lot of people think that the OTAs are a blank sheet of paper. And we've learned an awful lot over the decades of acquisition, so we are taking advantage of bringing in some of those terms and conditions that we know. But It's the ability to go to those non-traditional contractors, bring them in, and expose them to what we're doing. And as we negotiate IP and we do some things differently in the OTAs where we're not so rigid in the FAR base, it does open up possibly a challenge in that competitive down select or in that competition there. I think we're doing an amazing job. I think the CFTs working with our PEOs are helping each other immensely in knowing that these are the kind of things you need to get to this phase to know we have competition. I saw one just the other day where we had an OTA that successfully tested through prototype 2 different contractors, and now we're going into a FAR-based for a competition to go to full rate production. And that is a trade-off that's being done there that we've done for many years, so we're really good at that. We're using those same kind of practices in the OTAs. I oftentimes don't know, we're going a lot faster, but I don't know if it's on the backs of many of our professionals that are working really hard to make these a success that we're getting there. So I think we'll keep improving that, but I'm confident that we have brought them through what our normal structures are. We've just expedited because we've gotten some relief from some legislation and from some other reviews. So it gives the appearance that we've done this, but I think the competition that's happening at that point is an even playing field.
Thank you.
Can you read the question again?
Yep, I will. I got to find it. The use of OTAs to rapidly develop a prototype has distinct advantages to the Army. It also gives a distinct advantage to the company doing the prototype. How do you ensure that when you get to the competitive phase, that there's actually an ability to compete on an even playing field?
I mean, the main point of that is the Army says what it wants. It wants something quickly, and it's going to ask somebody to show them a prototype. If they like the prototype, then go buy it. And from industry's perspective, it doesn't really matter whether it's OTA or FAR Part 12 or FAR Part 14. You know, all of those should be able to accomplish the same thing. Understand what the Army wants, deliver them a prototype quickly, and then once they get an idea that they like the prototype or don't like the prototype, that they can buy it. You know, the competitiveness in the intellectual property kind of depends on who pays for the prototype. You know, it doesn't matter if it's an OTA or FAR Part 12, FAR Part 15. If the government says, well, industry, we'd like you to invest your IRAD to develop this prototype, then the industry owns it. And then the competition for that, you know, it is defined by who actually owns the intellectual property on that. So the Army says, well, I want that thing, and the intellectual property for that thing is owned by the private industry partner who developed it, then your ability to compete that specific thing is limited. If the Army says, well, I want something like that, then the competition is more open. But I don't think it's a matter of whether it runs through an OTA or the GSA schedule or FAR-based contract. I think the answer to the question is really more fundamental. Who is putting capital at risk? Is the Army paying for the development? The Army is paying for the development. The Army owns the development. If it's not, then then the dynamics of that changes. That's really where it starts, and it's which party, the buying party or the selling party, is taking what risk at what point in that process. And so understand what the business deal is first, and then find a contracting approach that matches the business deal.
Thank you. This one is for Dr. Ross, and then I'd like to follow up from Mr. McAleese afterward. Is the Army well aligned with Congress and OSD as we pursue the acquisition reform and enabling acquisition authorities?
Thanks. So there has been a lot of activity in acquisition reform over the last several years. You're probably well aware of that. There's a lot of drive for that, both within the department and in Congress. The Army is moving forward in a lot of areas, and I think the quick answer is yes, and here's why. There are, little known fact, actually, if you go back through the FY16 through the FY19 NDAAs, there were 323 provisions related to acquisition. And I had my team go back and re-scrub it to make sure that we were taking advantage of every opportunity that we had. And in going through that process, it was really enlightening. First of all, there's a lot of, Congress has been prolific. And there was a lot in there. When you start peeling back things like required reports and things that applied to other entities, not the Army, and pilot programs, you start to get to see, whittled down to a core set of statutory authorities. What's interesting is that we are utilizing a lot of the goodness that's in there. There's, not everything was good. I mean, there were some things that did not, that wasn't applicable, but I think that we're using a lot of things like the principles of the MDA delegation, speed, different ways and techniques to do speed, like rapid prototyping, a variety of programs or policies on rapid prototyping, middle tier acquisition, OTAs. We're also more in line than some of the others in terms of executing and implementing some other things like intellectual property is a great example. This is something that Congress wanted us to rebalance the interests of industry and government, and so we leaned forward on that, and we're having great success in working to scale that department-wide, working with Ellen Lord and her team on that. So I think there is I think that we've had some good momentum, and I think that we continue to, even in our own initiatives that don't relate specifically to a congressional action, they're all very much in alignment and inspired by a lot of the work that was in the past legislation.
Great. Jim, over to you.
This will be a first for the day. My answer is very short, right? There was no laugh from the audience. I think I'm
have your own metric.
Well, good, because I got another one right after this for you, so get ready.
Yes, yes, sir. They've given you tons of money, right? The DoD investment accounts are at an all-time high, right? Congress has given the authority to run the programs back to the services, right? I think the OSD only has oversight over what, future vertical lift now, and I think IAMD, and you have everything else, sir?
That's correct.
Right? Congress has given you the money. You've been over and you've made hard decisions in your portfolio trades. I can see them, right? The faster, I can also see you adopting things like Section 804 to drive these schedules forward. So, I mean, to be honest, this is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I don't anticipate seeing this alignment of the stars again, probably for another 10 or 15 years.
And I'm just going to take a minute to a little follow-up. It's worth noting, too, that we pay special attention and we take a lot of effort to stay connected with OSD and the Hill to make sure that we aren't abusing any of the authorities and the opportunities we've been given. To Jim's point, this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. The stars are aligning, and it is with great care that we have to move out so that we don't experience any kind of pulling back. And you can start to sense, or you're starting to hear, we are definitely starting to hear that Congress is very interested in the way that we're using things like OTAs and 804 and across the different services. So we're being very conscientious, very judicious, and we're communicating really clearly and well to them exactly how we're doing this.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So, Jim, to follow up with this and some of your other discussion, you spoke about the Army 2020 budget. The statement is that is a wish list. Please share your thoughts on what may actually be appropriated. Where do the non-appropriated cuts occur, and what is your crystal ball say about OMFV cannot meet requirements by 2023?
That's like a compounded.
Yeah. Let me just.
My wife submitted that question, didn't she, sir?
Yeah.
Trying to keep me on my toes.
It is written, he's my husband, but please go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. All right. So what was the first part of the question?
Yeah. spoke about the Army 2020 budget. That's a wish list. Please share your thoughts on what may actually be appropriated.
Right. So my opinion's irrelevant. Let me tell you what the investors are expecting of the companies that are involved in these programs. The timing, sir, the investors figure we're going to have a CR, right? You're not going to get a 2020 budget on time. Sequester will happen, if it occurs in 2020, will occur in early January 2020. So the investors although the defense stocks are up generally 16 to 20% so far this year, those investors are expecting a CR that runs to early January. They're expecting a deal on a 2020-2021 BBA in early January. No, they are not expecting $750 billion, number one. Investors are expecting at least flat $716 billion in 2020, which is a flat line from 2019, or they're expecting a number of about $733 billion for the whole department, right, which would give us about 3% growth. Within the Army acquisition pocket specifically that you would ask, sir, during the SASC hearing so far and the SAC-D hearing so far, there didn't seem to be any congressional resistance from either the authorizers or the appropriators. But to be candid, sir, Congress has been very supportive so far, but I would generally tend to look at three specific portfolios. I would generally tend to watch Boeing on the CH-47s, right? 50% of Boeing's executive compensation comes from free cash flow generation. And so if Boeing's not generating lots of big production, right, they're not generating any cash flow, right? So that's probably going to be in action. I would also expect there to be some replus up of JLTVs, right? You've seen that Oshkosh's stock has been down, about 6-7%, because that's a critical program for that particular company. But other than those two things, sir, I think your budget will probably survive intact with Congress in 2020.
Very good.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, here's one. I'm going to ask Mr. Hazlett to take a stab, but it might be Dr. Ross because it is an acquisition reform. With the growth of all these OTAs over time, industry now has to hunt for opportunities in stovepipes. Is there a way FESBID ops list all the opportunities out on a bids for OTAs? Is that a possibility in the future? Or how can we work that to open it up to industry more that they can see all the opportunities that OTAs are offered?
Well, I can answer that from a lot of different ways, but I'd like to give a shout out to a lot of the senior contracting officials that are here from the different commands, from the Corps of Engineers and Army Contracting Command, because I think they're doing an amazing job at outreach. And the outreach they're doing is industry days on a battle rhythm, monthly, quarterly, that opens the doors for easy accessibility to non-traditionals and traditionals contractors to come in to see what is our projected forecast, where are we at with actions that we know are going to come to a point that they're going to either be publicized or are we doing this in another method. So I think that's wonderful. We have taken an awful lot on to say how can we continue to do and improve on our market outreach to do that. The opportunities, I think that as we continue to advertise and say this is the type of vehicle I'm going to use, I think that Andy said it best, you know, that these are just tools in a toolbox that we're looking at the requirements. OTAs is not the only solution. We have broad agency announcements. We had some legislation that just helped us take broad agency announcements into advanced technology, which had not only been in basic and applied before. So as we select the tools out, it's actually just that communication that Mr. White has talked about and others to say, we've got to start talking to industry, non-traditional and traditional, about the gleam in our eyes of what we're looking for coming down that far.
You good? Okay. Good.
Difference.
So here's a question. I'm going to throw it out. I'm going to ask Mr. Hove to talk about it a little bit, and then possibly Mr. Hazlett also to follow up. If there are contracting steps that are not necessary in OTA contracts, what steps can be removed or leaned from the FAR and other contracting approaches to get to that other speed? What are your thoughts on that?
All of them?
Yeah.
right? Not necessary for an OTA contract, and and again, I'll go back to it. I mean, what is the basic business proposition? You know, what stage are you in? Which party is taking what degree of risk in developing the product or going forward? And so I think the best approach is to take a top to bottom, whole of government look on what is the absolute underlying statutory basis for whatever contracting mechanism there is. Peel everything down to that and find out what got built up on top of it over time. I mean, there are policies, practices, and procedures that leads the Army to decide whether they're going to use a FAR Part 12 or a FAR Part 15 contract. Both have statutory basis, but what's the culture, what's the practice, what's the muscle memory that gets the Army to choose one versus another? And I think that if really the point is speed of contracting, speed of execution, then it's got to be looked at holistically on every tool in the Army's toolbox to put things under contract. And that if they get to because they're just going to be, as a practical matter, there are going to be some things that the Army wants that it can't buy it on an OTA contract. Those things are needed quickly also. And to just look across the board on what that is. And yes, that it's, you know, that at the end of the day, what's going to happen is it will, as a practical matter, drive to judgment of the contracting officer with a warrant to choose on that. They need to be better trained in what they do, and they need to have, you know, better levels of delegated authority to make the right decision. That's a complex problem for all of us to work on.
I'd like to, I mean, I don't know if it's heresy, but, you know, the Competition and Contracting Act, I don't think I need it anymore. You know, it's been around since 1984, and it tells me fundamental things that I already know, that there's nothing better than a firm fixed price competitive acquisition. As long as I know exactly what I want, and I've got good competition, a real effective competition, and I can award to a firm fixed price and place the risk where it should be, and then have the fortitude to hold on to the requirement and freeze the requirement and allow my industry partner to deliver is the best. So, I mean, but I scale back from that because in SECA, there's an awful lot in there about protest. There's an awful lot in there that weigh us down that we can't get there. So I read every J&A, justification and approval for a sole source over $93 million. I read every one of those. That comes up to the senior acquisition executive, to Dr. Jetty, to approve. And quite honestly, we've asked Congress to raise that threshold. Raise the threshold to allow us, the PEOs and the CFT leads out there, to make the decisions that they need to, because they know what's best. We have asked for other relief. We've gotten some pilots. We had for FMS, we had some pilots for a little while, which we proved that were very successful. So we'd like to see those kind of things changed. What used to be called the TINA, Truth in Negotiation Act, is now what the Truthful Negotiation Act. But the dollar limit there has been raised to $2 million. We had a pilot for up to $5 million. I'd like to see that raised up higher. The Section 809 panel has just concluded and submitted their report to Congress. And the volume, I forget how big it is, in 3 different volumes over the last couple years. The last volume talked to taking a radical look at the commercial marketplace and making those kind of changes. I've talked to Alexis a lot about what is the appetite for the HASC and the SAS to maybe take some of these things on, which we're not getting that feedback that they're willing to take a wholesale look at the way we are buying commercial items right now. So I don't see those coming in the next year, maybe the year after, but we have gone back and asked for a lot of relief from different statutes as we're identifying in our cycle times. This is just not adding no value whatsoever. So we keep that constant dialogue with our friends on the Hill of those things. I don't know if Dr. Ross, you want to add anything?
I think Congress is looking really carefully at our use right now of OTAs. I think they're also looking carefully at Congress. I know that the Senate in particular the Senate Armed Services Committee is very interested in contracting. So if we are going to see some additional items, additional activity, I think I would expect to see it out of the SASC this year. And we're working with them and keeping in close communication as that proceeds. So we'll be seeing how that works out.
Thank you. If you don't know, Dr. Ross has a lot of experience in Congress, so it's good to have her on the team. This one, the subject is Introduction to New Technology into Formations, and this is for Mr. White. How does sunk costs associated with current systems impact decisions about and the introduction of new systems or technologies?
So it's a difficult question, one we wrestle with practically every single day. It's really not so much the sunk cost in the system as it is what does it take to keep the system current and relevant in the future. So you can look at our current, as the Undersecretary said, the Big Five. Look what's out there, and if we wanted to keep it current and relevant, we'd have to sink every modernization dollar into it that we have in this budget, the next budget, and on and on and on. We'd never buy anything new. All we do is continually upgrade the system that we have. Eventually, we'd end up with, 50, 60-year-old systems that were marvels of current, add-on technology on 50-year-old platforms. At some point, you've got to make a decision fundamentally that you need a new platform, new infrastructure, and I think that's one of the great benefits of Army Futures Command. Those are very difficult decisions to be made. I mean, the key stakeholders, just think about it. You got TRADOC, FORSCOM, AMC, G3, G4, G8, ASALT, Leavenworth, the proponent schoolhouses. There's a lot of people that have opinion and votes on it. But now you've got Army Futures Command with General Murray over there, and in his role as the Army's modernization officer, he's the one that looks and says, I'm okay with this platform being in its current configuration the way it is for the next 8 years until we can field the next version. You can stop investing in upgrades on this program. We'll live with what is, and I want you to take that and build me the next generation vehicle. And that's what we're proceeding to do. That's what our entire modernization philosophy is built around. That's why we made hard decisions on whether to go from the Bradley A4 to the Bradley A5 or not. Whether or not there's going to be yet another version of the M1. Whether or not we're going to continue with the Block 2 Chinook or the next block upgrade of the Apache. You can't afford everything. You've got to decide when you've got something good enough, snap the chalk line and move forward. And that's exactly what we've done in our modernization priorities. And I'm not going to tell you they're easy decisions. And we can sit in this room and debate all day whether or not it was a good decision or it was a bad decision. But that's what AFC is charged with doing, and I think it's a great model. Anybody that's ever tried to have a committee meeting with all those other stakeholders and come to a conclusion would tell you that it's just awful to wrestle with. You get that many people in the room where the decision makers can only be the secretary and the chief. You kind of end up with a big food fight. Now it's very few people in the room, primarily the Big Four, Dr. Jetty, General Murray, and the decisions are calculated, cold, and quick.
Thank you. This one's for Dr. Ross. You made an earlier point on this on acquisition reform, that it doesn't really have its intended effect unless it's implemented across the Army. How are you implementing things like the IP policy across the Army so that everyone has the same sight picture?
Mm-hmm. What I like about this question is I have two-part answer. So first, it's worth taking a second to talk about reform and how you actually get it to stick in general. And then I'm going to talk through some specifics about the IP policy. So this is actually my third job in reform. 3 different places, a few different topic areas, but there's a few things you learn along the way. There's some basic principles that are always consistent. Reform is really just a good idea until it's implemented. It's the hardest part. It's like 75% of the work. And that hardest part about implementation is changing culture. And I think that the best way to do that is really simple. You have to have clear, consistent communication from the leadership, and you have to continue drumbeating that over time. So messaging and time. And that is a key component to how we do things, and there's a lot of work in the implementation cleanup that has to be done. So, for example, we talked a lot about acquisition reform this whole hour. We've talked a lot about a variety of different things that have happened, smaller individual little pieces. Well, it all has to get memorialized, right? And so one of the things that Dr. Jetty asked us to do is to go through and scrub all of our policies. So ASA had 167 policies on the books, and we needed to go through and make sure that everything was aligned with the strategic principles of this Army leadership, and that it incorporated all these new acquisition reform activity. So we did a good look. We rescinded 116 policies, and then we're now mandatory updating the rest, the 51, the remaining. So that is a big endeavor. And Dr. Jetty also has a policy that you can't have, a policy on policies. You can't have a policy in place for longer than 2 years. It has to go through revision. So that kind of institutionalizing and inculcating it into the system is just the necessary cleanup of the battlefield that you've got to do after you make these big shifts. So for IP, what we're doing, so we're kind of in phase 2 at this point. We had this big policy come out, and now we're in the implementation. And how we specifically get after that is, this is a really difficult subject matter. Not a lot of people understand it. So the first step was having Dr. Jetty release an implementation guidance that's obviously a lot longer than the policy, but it's necessary to get everyone on the right page from across the contracting and logistics and the program management community. Helps by first giving a background on what IP is, what's the difference between a data rights and data deliverables. There's a major difference. And then, so that's a helpful, useful, more explanatory tool for the field to really operationalize this and understand how to use it. The second step for us on IP is training and communication, and we I've been working with DAU. Ms. Laura's been really generous in letting us go right to them and help them develop additional IP materials. So we're in talks with some, and they're getting really adaptive and modern with the way they're doing things. They want to do a bunch of videos to help train the workforce. And I know that that Mr. Hazlett's used a lot of videos to train his workforce as well. I think that's a good tool, micro videos. So that's useful. And that training and education piece is complemented by mobilizing what expertise you do have already in place. So we pulled together 20 to 25 folks from across the contracting community, the AMC sustainment community, and from the program offices. And these are people that had at the local levels done a lot of IP work. They are our in-house experts, but they're very infrequently ever brought together to collaborate and to put out new information and guidance. So we're using them in 2 ways. We pulled them together to help us flesh out the implementation guidance to make it a real usable document to the field. And we're also having them help us run some Pathfinder test cases, which is the final point I'll make about the implementation of the IP policy. I think it's critically important that when you have something, that you endeavor something as difficult as this, that you send a few things through the pipeline to see how it works, test out the kinks. So we select 3 or 4 programs to go through and be guinea pigs, where we take the temporary team of IP experts and we help them develop their IP strategy so that it's in alignment with the policy. The great benefit to that is, as you know, when anything's really hard, you always ask, well, is there somebody else that did it before that I can look at and see how they did it? So these test cases they'll serve as exemplars for the folks that are coming after. And also, the second thing that we're going to use this for is we're going to get a lot of lessons learned from this, and then we'll go back and revise the implementation guidance probably within a year, maybe two, so that we can get feedback from the field, feedback from these test cases, and feedback from industry. And so we're gathering that up now, so please do bring us your input and ideas. So in conclusion, it's critically important to stick at it and to keep going and go through the process of all of those various activities from the headquarters down to the field level.
Yeah, I think it's very successful for you when you actually put it out and give industry an opportunity to look at it as well and talk about it. That's been very helpful.
And Jim, I want to just, Dr. Ross is being too humble. She went through those 160 some policies ruthlessly, and she actually cut it down to what, 35 originally? We chickened out in the headquarters and added 16 of those back. Talk about reducing bureaucracy. Dr. Ross has been absolutely ruthless in weeding it out.
Very good. Thank you. This one's for, I'm going to have Mr. McAleese talk about it a little bit, then Mr. Hove, so you're not getting off on this one. And then since it's the start of baseball, I guess you're the cleanup pitcher or hitter here. So you ready? In many technology areas, state-of-the-art capabilities have shifted overseas. The rules and policies for working with long-term allies is really stuck in the past. What can the Army do to increase leverage of foreign capabilities to enhance soldiers' capabilities and be smart buyers?
You stumped me, sir.
Yeah.
What is the question fundamentally?
I'm sorry?
What is the question fundamentally?
Fundamentally, it is that right now we have a challenge working with our foreign partners and working with their technologies to integrate them into ours. The policies are really not open to allow us to do that in some cases because they've been written in the past. Is there, fundamentally, what's your thoughts of that? And do you think there ought to be a more open ability to do that in the future?
To be honest, sir, I completely apologize. When I listen to General Milley, I can see his passion for destroying those Russian SAM sites, to open up the corridors so the Air Force can get fourth-gen aircraft in. I can see his focus on long-range precision fires being obliterate those Chinese islands if necessary. So when I'm looking at it, I apologize, sir. I see Congress has given you the money. I've seen you structure, you've slashed your programs to the 8 areas that really count, 31 critical programs. And I've seen no indication that you're not letting everybody get to the table. What I do see is you are compressing the schedule. You're slashing applied research, right? And you're slashing advanced technology development. And you're concentrating everything you've got in advanced component development, which is basically prototyping and metal bending, right? And what I can see out of General Murray is he's fundamentally letting everybody come into the fight. So to be honest, sir, I apologize. I don't see that you're doing anything.
You don't see it being constrained at all?
I don't see that you're doing, I fundamentally perceive that if a foreign contractor's got a better solution, you know, for example, indirect fire protection capability, who's you buying, right? I sense that the Army leadership at this particular point in time, since it's not going to come again for at least 15, 20 more years, I don't sense any hesitation with going with the best solution that gives you the greatest lethality.
May I add one point before Andy, because I'd like to hear how Andy addressed this too, is that we've gone through this whole discussion without a discussion on cybersecurity. And as we talk about our suppliers and we go down to foreign contractors or how we are trying to do as best we can, is that there's been an awful lot of legislation written on cybersecurity as we're trying to put that in. So as we're trying to reform, there are some things coming at us from the other angle that may be slowing us down for the right reasons in that case. So Andy, I didn't know if you did.
Yeah. I'll be honest, I think it's kind of, the question's on a false premise. I don't see anything out there that's not currently built in the United States that the Army would want that it can't figure out a way to get. I mean, there's some, you know, it kind of goes back to the basics, right? Don't buy it because it's non-U.S. just to buy it because it's non-U.S., right? Don't buy something you don't need. Don't buy new technology versus old technology for the sake of buying new technology. What does the Army need? Where does it exist now, and how do you get at it? There are going to be some practical things that the Army's going to have to deal with, you know. Like every country in the world, the U.S. taxpayer expects that dollars appropriated for defense equipment generate jobs in the U.S. Germany expects the same thing. The United Kingdom expects the same thing. Every country in the world, that's why they all build their own stuff. And so there's going to be an expectation. It doesn't matter whether it's, you know, the technology is currently in use or it's technology they're using that we're not using, that it comes back here. You know, the Commander of Forces Command in yesterday's panel with industry made what I thought was probably the most cogent observation about this whole modernization issue that we're facing. It's not a matter of new technology or old technology. It's not a matter of when, but take it from the perspective, you know, I don't know if everybody's steeped in military operations, but basically all of them end at some point in the ground where, you know, U.S. forces are victorious on the objective where they want to be. If you have two units that have seized that objective, and one of them has one type of ammunition, and the other one has a different kind of ammunition, the first thing you do when you seize an objective is you consolidate and run all that through. Now, if you're using two different types of ammunition, one that's modern, one that's old, you're causing a problem in the operational force. That's not, whether it's new or old, that's just, you know, what are the realities first, you know, for the operating units that are executing the mission that we expect them to do. And the modernization has to be done in a way that it solves problems and doesn't create others. I'll give you one example. When I served in the Army, I was a battalion motor officer at a point in time when we were still burning diesel and gasoline. So we had engines that were diesel, engines that were gasoline, and not only did we have to be able to repair those, we had to be able to get two different types of fuel at the point in the battle where it mattered. One of the greatest decisions the Army ever made was to go to a single fuel strategy. Everything the Army has today burns JP8 fuel, which is probably the dirtiest form of diesel fuel you can burn, but you can find it anywhere in the world. So, you know, if the modernization says, I'm going to have vehicles that burn something other than JP8, you got to figure out how to get that other fuel there. At the same time, for a very long time, everything else you have is going to burn JP8. So it's not a new technology, old technology, U.S. technology, foreign technology issue. It's what technologies get adopted, put into use, that you have an expectation you can fight with tonight or tomorrow when that's employed, and that the Army can be effective in that. I don't think there's, I don't see an unmitigatable path to getting something built outside of the United States into the U.S. in use with the Army. If that's what they want, there are tools at the Army's disposal to get there.
Yeah, and I'll back clean up on that. I agree with you, Andy. I don't think that, well, let me start by saying, you know, Dr. Jetty's been very clear and on the record in the past that if whoever's got the best system, if it's going to enable a soldier or save their life, we're going to buy it. We don't care who makes it. We're going to buy the best equipment that's out there for our soldiers, wherever it comes from. And I think there are plenty of programs that are out there right now, whether it's Trophy, Iron Dome. You know, we've got manufacturers from Rafael, Leonardo, Thales. We do business with a lot of foreign firms, a lot of foreign countries, and we buy a lot of foreign kit that we put in our Army. Of course, there are rules. I mean, if the question is more oriented towards it's sometimes difficult to do that, sure. You know, we're not going to share the crown jewels, if you will, on some of these systems with just everybody. If we buy a armored vehicle hull, the prototype or whatever, we may not share how our battle command systems and you know, advanced sensors work with that person. But there's lots of ways around it. Most of these companies have SSA or proxy companies that are here in the States that are U.S. owned and controlled that you know, protect the technology. Or in many cases, it's through partnerships with the large integrators. You can just have to go as far as the floor out there, and you can see dozens and dozens of foreign weapon systems, foreign technologies that are being integrated by our major integrators across the Army. So I don't think it's that difficult to get a foreign technology in there. There are reasonable safeguards. We assist foreign companies every day in helping them with their ITAR concerns and those transfers. DASA-DEC, the Defense Export and Cooperation, which is part of ASALT, is engaged every single day in doing that type of business, and I think fairly successfully. The only concerns I ever get on foreign technology is when we put out the RFPs. They're usually classified annexes, and if you're not a U.S. company, there are additional hoops that you may have to go through in order to get access to those parts of the proposals, and I think that's prudent and rightly so. But there are ways to do it, and companies do it successfully every single day. I'm not sure that I would advocate changing a lot of that.
Sure. Very good. Well, we have now run out of time. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank AUSA for putting this panel on. This is obviously, you have the leadership of the Army's acquisition reform, contracting, you've got thought leaders, and you have industry here. I appreciate everyone hanging in there and asking some pretty tough questions. And I'm going to pass the other questions that you had that I didn't have time for to the individuals. So if you want to go up to them and talk to them about it, please do. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Jim. Well, thanks, General Rogers and Mr. White and the panel. And for those of you who stayed, I think you realized that it was well worth your time. Certainly an insightful and informative panel to wrap us up. And Andy, just to set the stage, you complained about MoGas and diesel. When I started the Army, we were mostly coal, steam, and oxen powered, you know, so we got nothing.